Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to blow more oxygen on the growing tools for thinking sector, addressing key issues and talking with the people who are doing the work. This podcast is created by BetaWorks, a New York City-based startup studio. I am Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper, and our topic today is public or private brains. Our guests are Anne-Laure Cunff, the founder of Ness Labs, and Thiago Forte, the founder of Building a Second Brain. I'm just really curious, just for starters, when you thought of the second brain, Thiago, was it a public brain? Was it a private brain outside of my brain for my own personal use? Where did you start?
I mean, I didn't come up with the term second brain. That's been around a long time. It was part of Evernote's marketing. You know, Evernote was your second brain. The stuff you've been doing, I've been following you for years. I don't know if you've ever used that term, but I feel like, you could have. I mean, there's even stuff like this idea that your gut, your intestine is your second brain. That's been around for a long time. So I just sort of caught the wave as it was cresting and was like, yes, this is what I'm doing too. I'll help you be part of it.
And Laura, where does this, when you first heard the term, what did you think?
I discovered the term in that context. I agree with Thiago. It's been around for a while. I think the first time I heard it actually was in the context of the gut, not in the context of tools for thinking. So when I discovered it used like that for note-taking, collecting ideas, connecting them together, it was actually Thiago who introduced me to these ideas. And I had been using a different term myself, which I call a digital garden, for that kind of public brain that you build and that you share with other people and that you invite people to contribute to as well.
Love that. And what's interesting is in my obsessive sort of use of the brain, and we're in December right now, so it is officially 25 years since I started using the brain, because it was December 1997. I've passed 500,000 thoughts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really interesting. And I'm talking to the Brain Company. We're going to do a little bit of an anniversary celebration of some sort. But the default setting for all thoughts in my brain is public. And I synchronize my brain to their servers and then send links to people, hey, you can go here and look in my brain. The Brain Company sort of deprecates that feature and says that's just so that you can share a brain from your work computer to your home computer. For me, this is like publishing ideas into the commons, and it's really, I think is more important than they think it is. But I just want to come back to the default setting, because I don't ever make a choice to make something public. Everything is public unless I check a little box that says, oops, this is confidential, or if I run a workshop for some company that shouldn't be heard of outside, I will check a little box in that workshop. I'll put I'll of course create something in my brain around it. Nobody else but me, anyone logged in as me, will only be able to see it. But I think these default settings matter a whole bunch, because otherwise not a lot's going to wind up in the commons, or is it?
I have a completely different approach, so it's interesting. Everything is private by default in my note-taking system, and that is because I put all of my thoughts in the same place. And that includes very private thoughts that I would not necessarily want to share with other people. And I don't even think they would be interested in reading in any case. And that's why I call it a digital garden, but I cultivate these thoughts. I turn these seeds into trees of knowledge with branches that grow and that I connect together. And I only share the fruit, basically, of that process, which can be at a very, very early stage. I don't necessarily wait until I have a fully, perfectly written essay to share that with the world. It could be a tweet, for example, with just the beginning of an idea. It could be a longer thread. It could be a YouTube video. It could be in an episode of a podcast, such as we're doing now. But I do a little bit of private work before my ideas are ready to be shared with the world.
Which makes a ton of sense. Thiago?
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. For me, everything you described and everything I've seen from how you use the brain, the software program, is how I use Twitter. It's Twitter. It is for raw thoughts, unfinished thoughts, harebrained, kind of crazy, possibly nonsensical, things that I want to almost it's like throwing like a spark out into the universe and seeing what happens. And most of the time, nothing happens. But once in a while, it's usually the thing you least expect. What you thought was just like a shower thought, like the last thing I tweeted before I signed off from work that day, ends up being one of the most successful things. I really think of Twitter that way. I'm familiar with the brain, and so in theory, I love that idea of publicizing all your thoughts. But I think I've had this experience of sharing my notes with people, and they don't understand them, or they don't know what to do with them, or they find it annoying, or they're like, well, what am I supposed to take away from this? And so over time, I think I've done that less, where I've come to the conclusion that I have to do a lot of work to sort of bridge the divide from my mind to theirs. Otherwise, they just go, what even is this that you're sending me?
Exactly. What was that? Why did you do that? And it makes total sense. And I think it's really interesting that we have different settings for what we're putting into these different tools. I might put private thoughts into a Google Doc, and then I might have a link to the Google Doc, but not the password. It might be a private Google Doc, so that I can find it again, but it's not open for other people to peruse. But in general, when I'm authoring in it, I'm authoring for two publics, me and everyone else. And that works absolutely well for me. In really interesting kind of ways. Another thing I'm finding is that it's hard to describe what the shared space is, the commons of ideas. I don't know if you have a way of describing this to other people, but for me, the comparison I make is with Wikipedia. I can tell you exactly what Wikipedia is, what software it runs, where it's hosted, what its business model is. It's all open. It's an encyclopedia that uses a wiki. And boy, that's very, very concrete, right? And it's a nice frame and a boundary, but it's also the thing that limits Wikipedia from being this extra shared memory space where we can have our own opinions and our own ideas and research and sort of do collective inquiry together. But then, what is that space? How do you describe that collective space to people? Or are you hitting that problem?
I think a lot of companies have tried to build products that solve for this. There's a Hypothesis, for example, that allows you to install a browser extension that adds a layer of information on top of any web pages. And you can add your own thoughts, your own notes. Everyone can comment on this. And it adds this public discourse to any page on the internet. The problem with a lot of these tools is that none of them have hit a critical mass where you could really say that this is the public arena where everyone is having those conversations. The closest today is Twitter, but it's not overlaid on top of the web. We're having those conversations next to those other pages and those pieces of content. It does have a lot of really good features. The fact that you can link to each other, reply to each other, quote tweet, and all of these things that I think help a lot in building on top of the building blocks that other people have posted. But I'm not aware right now of a tool that has solved that problem, both from a technical standpoint, but from just the social standpoint as well, of having a big enough community where the conversations can have an impact that's big enough.
Exactly. And I find it ironic and interesting that it took Elon Musk almost destroying Twitter for many of us to go, oh my God, Twitter is actually really important, really useful, and kind of not replicable. Like Mastodon doesn't actually do what Twitter does. It's not a big enough public space. And it's so interesting. And back to what you were saying, Thiago, a moment ago, I have a long time ago story about Twitter. I was living in San Francisco, just left a meeting south of Market, and I tweeted to nobody in particular, just left a meeting about the cash healthcare economy, didn't know it existed. 2 days later, I get a Facebook post, because back then all my tweets were being reposted to Facebook, from a second-degree acquaintance, a person I don't know very well, who writes me 10 paragraphs about how years ago he took his family off of conventional health insurance and how happy they've been with it. And I didn't know that somewhere in my degrees of connectivity, that story lived. And I loved that story. It was just like, wow, okay, there was no particular motivation for me to say that on my way out, and I learned something later from my community. So that's when I first started figuring out that, okay, there's something really, really kind of special here. Do either of you have stories that have happened to you kind of on that order of things where the light bulb went off and you were like, Thiago, like what?
Oh my gosh. This is what's so hard to explain about Twitter. especially to people who don't use it that much or who don't use it at all, is they go, you go on and it just seems annoying and chaotic and confrontational and full of needless and pointless drama, and it is. But once you've been on there a certain amount of time, and I would say you probably need a certain number of followers or a certain number of connections. I mean, things like that happen almost every week to me. Like, I tweet just the most random, what did I tweet this week? Like, just a few days ago, I said, this is a business-related one, but I was like, does anyone have an easy way to cut costs in a company? Like a checklist, a way of thinking, a framework, and someone just responded, well, here's the classic book on the subject of how to cut costs. And I'm like, perfect, download the book. But then I'm a busy guy. I'm a parent. I'm trying to run a business. Like the next day, it's going to take me a while to get to the book. The next day, someone adds to that thread and said, by the way, here's a tweet thread summarizing the book. Just these people coming in from these just completely unexpected directions. Just like, by the way, here's the exact solution to your problem that you didn't even know existed.
This is the hive mind at work around us. Anne-Laure?
Same as Thiago, it's hard to know where to start when it comes to Twitter. All of my team, all of my employees, I found on Twitter. So
wow.
that's one thing. Yes, it's almost I'm so embedded in the Twitter ecosystem that if I were to hire someone that I didn't find through Twitter, I would ask them straight away to create a Twitter account on their first day as a way to understand what we do, because I don't think they'd be able to really understand what we're doing and our community, the kind of people we connect with and who we're trying to reach, if they don't have at least a basic understanding of that magic, chaotic place that Twitter is. And in terms of specific things, very similar to Thiago, every time I have a question, I just post it. There's very few places, I think, on the internet where you can just send a private message to anyone. And I mean anyone. You could finish reading a book and this author is this New York Times bestseller author. You could just drop them a message and say, thank you so much for your book, and maybe even ask a question, not being annoying and asking too many questions, but they would reply. And even if they don't, nobody's going to think that you're a creep for doing this. Whereas if you slide in someone's DMs on Instagram or another social network, most people are just going to block you and delete the message, because why would you reach out to someone you don't know? And on Twitter, reaching out to people you don't know and connecting to people you don't know and turning those strangers into potential professional connections or friends is actually part of the unwritten code there.
Exactly. So are we saying we don't need other tools besides Twitter? I don't know that we're saying that. I think
No.
I think we're saying that there's a bunch of magic that Twitter performs that is hard to replicate and really useful. But what's the relationship between tweets and the rest of software, the rest of data?
I do think there's something about, like, we say, oh, we just go on Twitter and tweet any random thing. That's not exactly true, right? It's like you have to have some intentionality. You have to put some thought. You have to put especially some distillation. That's the thing that Twitter demands. You have to be so to the point. The first line of your tweet has to capture people's attention. And so that's what I think you have to do in a private place, in a private second brain, a private digital garden, a private whatever it is the front end of that. The collecting the raw inputs, collecting, refining, distilling. Not that Twitter is, the ultimate form of output. It's one of them. Those ideas and those insights and theories that you cultivate can go out through social media. They can go out through writing. They can go out through presenting, building new things. I do really feel that it's like garbage in, garbage out. If you want your outputs to be high quality, like, how do you make high quality outputs? Right? Like, do you sit at your desk and just crunch your eyes and just try really, really, really hard? The only way that I know how to do high quality is through quantity. It's through collecting and then digesting and filtering just a huge volume of ideas. I'm constantly reading, constantly consuming. It's like my one weird trick is to use quantity to get to quality.
There's a famous study, Practice Makes Perfect, about a pottery teacher who told half the class to make the best pot they possibly could make in their class and told the other half to just make as many pots as they possibly could make. And the ones who made many did much better.
Exactly.
Sorry, Anne-Laure, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I agree with Thiago. I think the only thing that really Twitter does when it comes to producing ideas is to allow you to shorten that feedback loop. You can test ideas much faster and at scale. And so that allows you to improve a lot quicker, to tweak things, to see how people react to them, which you can then implement and use into more consequential pieces of content if you are someone who creates content. But yes, if you keep on tweeting things that make no sense, you're also going to get feedback that makes no sense, and that's not going to help you in your process. So it's really just about shortening the feedback loop. And if you do that, and if you expose your ideas to the opinions of other people, if you're open to receiving that feedback and to improving your ideas based on that, I think it can be a really useful tool. So would be any other place where you can very quickly share your thoughts and very quickly get feedback.
And one of the nice things about Twitter is the immediacy of it. You have this feeling that people are watching their feeds quite a bit and replying a lot. And I like also sort of the topology of Twitter, where two people can have a more or less public-private conversation. They could answer a question, they could go pretty deep on something, but because they're tweeting openly, anybody who trips across their tweet stream can actually benefit from whatever it was they thought and said and built. And I just love that. For me, that's, why don't we have more tools and more of that? And what would it take to get more of that?
So I had a comment on something we were discussing previously that relates to this, which is that idea of why don't more people do this? I think all of us that do this share this. There's this background desire. We believe that if more people did this kind of thing, their thinking would be better. They would be smarter. They'd be more effective. They might even be healthier, have more peace of mind. And I think it has to do with there's a number of reasons, but it's this is kind of like metacognition is kind of what we're doing. We're thinking about thinking, right? Metacognition is hard. I mean, most people don't even do cognition. And we're asking them to add another layer, right? What is the percentage of the population that enjoys metacognition, that knows what it is, pursues it actively? It's basically the uber nerds of the world, right? And the uber nerds of the world, it's we can't reach critical mass with only uber nerds. We need at least some normal people to do this, to reach that mass.
It's interesting because there are people who you might consider not that smart or whatever, but it turns out that they're fabulous with baseball statistics or weaving fabrics and selecting fabrics or whatever. I think we've been dumbed down by our culture and some assumptions we have about tools and other sorts of things that are in some sense driven by the copyright industries and a bunch of things that are just history. They're just history. But they don't have to apply to how we collaborate and how we think together. Then I think it's really hard to let go of those assumptions. Because often we're not even aware of the assumptions. We kind of internalize the prohibitions about what to do with intellectual property or where things might go.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is just the assumption that thinking is hard and difficult and undesirable. To me, this is one of the clearest distinctions that I can tell sometimes usually within 5 or 10 minutes of talking to someone. There are people, and I don't say this in a judgmental way. I think this distinction is different from the smart, not so smart distinction, right? There's some people that are very smart. They just don't like thinking. They don't inherently enjoy thinking through complex, subtle, interrelated ideas. It's if I'm paid, I'll do it. But then there's other people that will do it, whether we're paid or not. You can't stop us from doing it because we enjoy it so much. And honestly, I feel like that attitude that thinking is undesirable, is hard and difficult, comes from school. School is basically a prison.
Yeah, it's a penitentiary where we send kids off. We remove them from reality so that none of their actions will have any effect on their neighborhoods or families. I absolutely agree. Go ahead, Anne-Laure.
I would also say that in addition to people who like to think or don't like to think, and that connects back to the idea of private or public brains, we also now, I was talking about those feedback loops, but we also have way faster judgment loops from other people. And I think we've been conditioned we're social animals. We want to be appreciated by other people. We want other people to think that we're smart. And I think to answer the question, why aren't there more people doing this? I think because a lot of people are paralyzed. They would rather not share their thoughts with the world and take the risk that someone tells them very publicly that what they said is stupid. So maybe they'll scribble down, they'll write notes, they'll have a private space where they'll think, but we will never see publicly any of those thoughts published to be shared with other people. So that fear of being judged, I think, is also a big factor in the fact that normal people are doing this. This is also why on lots of social networks, you see a lot more of those very polished images with filters, very curated images of what one's life looks like versus a bunch of random photos that you take throughout the days that represent different experiences that you have. And it's luckily shifting. It's a really good thing. You see more and more social networks that are shifting towards having a more authentic sharing experience where not everything is so curated. But yeah, I think this fear of being judged, this fear of being perceived as not smart enough or saying something stupid in public is also part of the equation.
Absolutely. And the public sphere right now feels more dangerous than it did even just a little while ago. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons to be hesitant about posting things in public. And the people I see whose writings I like the most are really courageous. They're putting things out there that are deeply interesting and sometimes controversial. And we have no way of slowing down the controversies and talking through them in some kind of, I don't mean systematic, like formal way, although that might be actually really useful. But I mean, how might we slow down an argument to understand better the components of the argument and then to deconstruct the argument a little bit? Because usually a point of view consists of a bunch of other opinions and beliefs that comprise the belief. And we never get to that in talking with others. So we have the knee-jerk responses or system one kind of responses to, oh, that's terrible, off with their heads. And we've deprecated peaceful, interesting thinking between people. I think at great loss for humans. Anne-Laure, like when you called what you were doing digital gardening, how much did the gardening metaphor influence what you were doing? Was there like a feedback loop where you were like, oh, this isn't gardening, or oh, wow, this is really gardening and I should do more of it?
I really saw it as gardening. Through the process, I realized while I was doing this that this looked like gardening, and then I kept on tweaking it so it looked more and more like gardening. But I thought the metaphor was incredibly helpful in terms of thinking about my ideas, in terms of planting good seeds, what Thiago mentions in his book, the information diet, right? So planting good seeds in your digital garden. So you start from something that's more likely to grow into interesting ideas. Also weeding out any things that you want to have there, being more intentional in terms of what you plant here. So I try to not have things that I don't think will be interesting in the future living rent-free in my note-taking system, basically. I try to just take a couple of seconds before adding something there to think, is it going to be helpful? And also not falling prey to that very satisfying feeling of just putting the link in there and figuring that I'll have a look later. So being intentional, taking my time, and also appreciating the fact that growing these ideas will take time, which is also something that I borrowed from gardening. It's really okay if I don't produce a lot of content based on what I collect and what I grow. Some really good ideas take a long time to grow and to evolve, and that's fine. So it's really helped me be more mindful, both in terms of input, what I put in my digital garden, but also in terms of output, knowing that there will be seasons where I'll be more productive and others where I'll be less productive, and that's completely okay.
Makes total sense to me. Sorry, Thiago, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I love the digital gardening. I think what's the big thing that's changed over just the past few years is it's known by various names, but the emergence of this new kind of category of applications. Rome Research was kind of the pioneer, also Obsidian, Logseek, now Tana. It's like there's a whole new kind of subcategory. And what they all share in common is I think they are emergent. They're like bottom up, right? You don't need to have this preconceived hierarchy that you then impose on the information. And I think the reason that has happened in just the past few years is emergence only works if there's intelligence, there has to be intelligence. Like in a garden, the intelligence is in the cells. The plants know they grow towards the light. They go around things. They know how to seek out the nutrients. So without that kind of built-in ambient intelligence, you don't have emergence. So now that we're starting to have software that you could actually say is just beginning to be intelligent. It's beginning to think for us a little bit. It's like a whole nother kind of thing that we now call digital gardening has arisen, which is just so exciting. It's like the benefits of being organized are now starting to become available to people who are not naturally organized, which is a much bigger group of people.
And it could be that the new large language models, GPT-3 and ChatGPT, all these other sorts of things, might help us make sense of our ramblings some, if they're implemented properly. That could be interesting. I know that one of Sam Arversman, I think, was experimenting by writing notes and sending them off to GPT-3 and then asking it for summaries of his writings. And it was doing a pretty good job. It was like coming back with good statements that made him think. And that's really interesting as well, because now we might have, would that be a third brain? Because when we write something down and externalize it as our second brain, either privately for ourselves or to share with everybody in the hive mind, that's a great second brain. I'm totally on board. All of a sudden, if we're in conversation with these other intelligences, and I will not open the can of worms about are they actually intelligent and all that, that's a fun conversation, but we don't need to solve that one. But is that a third brain, and is that how, I don't know, how do we think about that?
I usually actually use the private-public distinction to distinguish between those two. I usually say your second brain is private by default, although you can make parts public. And I sometimes just say the third brain is everything that's public. So it's interesting. That kind of relates back to what we're talking about. For you, there's no such distinction, right? It's like things go straight to the public sphere. But I guess that is quite an important sort of like boundary for me.
How do you think about it?
It's interesting because I think yesterday, a couple of days ago, I actually entered in ChatGPT. I asked the prompt. I just said, "Hi, I'm Anne-Laure Cunff. Can you give me ideas of articles to write about?" And the list was exactly the kind of stuff I would write about. So it's been trained on my data. Then I asked, "So who is Anne-Laure Cunff?" And then it wrote my biography. There were a couple of things wrong, my number of email subscribers, a few things, but really it was definitely my own biography. So it means that some of my publicly available content is part of the model. And the first thing I thought when that happened was, I wish I could feed it everything that is currently in my note-taking system, because it would come up with a lot. All of these ideas, it was really interesting. They were really good, but most of them were things I already wrote about. So not that helpful. But I have so many half-baked ideas in my note-taking system that I haven't quite yet figured out how to connect together to come up with something that would make sense as an essay that I could publish online. And I do think that these kind of tools are going to be really helpful in that way for any kind of creators, whether they're researchers, whether they're writers, whether they're YouTube video like creators, etc. I think those tools are going to be incredibly powerful in the future.
Totally agree. And interestingly, if you have one of these intelligences that's been trained on 3 or 4 different people's writings, maybe they become a collective mind for that group of people, and that could be super interesting, because the fact that that GPT-3 was reflecting you well back to you is like super cool even just today. But imagine something else happening between people who care about similar sorts of things.
I mean, we could use it to say write a conversation between Anne-Laure, Thiago, and Jerry, and then use one of those AI-based voice synthesizers to do the podcast. That's it. No need to show up anymore.
Use Lyrebird to falsify our voices, and then we could just record the podcast, like send it off and publish with the results, which is not that far off what we're probably going to be doing in a couple of years. I'm sure somebody's done that already. So I have a sense of mission around this second brain, public brain thing, and maybe I should start calling it the third brain, Thiago, just to honor, for you, the second brain is your private external, and your third brain is your public external. And that's really interesting to me as well, because I hadn't thought about it that way. But I feel a sense of sort of social mission for why the shared brains matter. because we're at a moment where humanity is facing a whole series of really big crises. We are in Mexican standoffs everywhere politically around issues that we should be not worrying about. In the U.S., we're fighting a rearguard action to keep the U.S. from becoming the handmaid's tale, when in fact there's all these other things we should be doing instead. And so I think that the public conversations, the hive mind needs to include people who don't think like us, who are of very different opinions. And I'm still as yet a little unclear how that works, because we're seeing it right now with Musk basically letting a whole bunch of people who got banned off of Twitter back onto Twitter, and we'll see sort of what happens there. But there's these very interesting conversations about what is appropriate speech. And we're live in the middle of these conversations, and they matter a lot, right?
Yeah, gosh, so much there. I mean, yeah, it's like a small segment of society is becoming, who know how to leverage these tools, is becoming superhuman. I mean, it's happening in real time. Like
Yep.
if you know how to wield, an email sending platform, a significant social media following, a large language model, and a couple other things, you have a power of a small nation state at this point. I think, and that's us. I mean, honestly, like we have that privilege, that power, but the people who don't are, I think, justifiably feeling left behind, and like something is unfair, something is uneven or not equitable, and it's not equitable. But the question of spreading this to more people, I mean, this is kind of what I've been engaged in the past few years. Like, this was the central challenge of writing my book. There was no theoretical, nothing that needed to be developed. There was no more advanced concept. There was no research, really. It was simplifying the ideas basically into memes, is how I've spent most of the past few years. And it is so hard because there's not a lot in our, I mean, there are some things in our everyday experience that are similar to a second brain, but it's also a big jump at the same time. I mean, in the past, the only people who created, searchable repositories of interlinked knowledge were like countries and maybe corporations. And now we're asking individuals to do it who already have no time, are just trying to get the kids off to school, are stressed trying to manage their email inbox. And now you want me to build a freaking second brain? Like,
Are you hopeless or hopeful? Like really, where are you right now about that? Because you're on a mission, which is really cool. And I don't know, do you feel lots of hope or just a little hope?
I mean, I open the sales numbers and the analytics for my book every day. To me, my bet, so to do traditional publishing, you have to bet that this is going to be a mainstream hit. If your book does not sell really well, you really should not go with a traditional publisher. So the current update is the book is, I think, teetering. It's on the edge of like between a niche, like breaking out of a niche, to tipping over to what you would call the mainstream, but it's really unclear which way it's going to go. It could really go either way. It could stall from this point, or it could take off. I'm definitely doing every single possible thing I can think of to tip it over. But one of the reasons I'm here is to enlist you guys in helping me.
So how can we help?
I mean, just talking about this, just spreading the word, providing more examples. I mean, so one reason I work closely with Anne-Laure a lot is you're one of the very, very few people, Anne-Laure, who knows how to speak about these things in a way that is like human understandable. Like 95 to 99% of all the discussion is like software engineers talking to other software engineers. I think you and I are good at using everyday metaphors, things that people just understand intuitively, which is why I said yes to be here. But just providing mental models that they already grasp, linking it to everyday problems that they already face, really showing and demonstrating the ROI for their career, for their stress, for their sleep, case studies, success stories, testimonials, basically marketing. It's just mass marketing.
Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah, as someone who worked as a marketer in a previous life in Silicon Valley, I feel your pain here when you have two completely different languages to talk about fundamentally the same thing, but approached from two completely different angles. And I think the reason why you're also doing such a great job with building a second brain at explaining it in a way that people can actually connect with is that for you, it started from real world human challenges that you were facing, and you built the process, the system around that, versus which I think a lot of technical people are guilty of, and I am sometimes guilty of, because I do suffer sometimes from the shiny toy syndrome, is to find something cool, a new technology, and trying to find a problem that I could address with that. So I think as long as any kind of like systems or tools that are created for helping people think better, or as you said, sleep better, communicate better, etc., are rooted in those fundamental challenges that they're trying to help address, and that the people communicating around those tools remember that instead of focusing too much on the underlying technology itself. And we're certainly doing that with AI at the moment. It's AI. Oh, great. What does it do? How does it help me? Those are the questions that people want to see answered when they're exploring different systems, and especially the ones that require quite a little bit of upfront investment for you to be able to then gain the benefits.
Yeah. And the GPT-ish conversations I'm following are very engineering, very geeky, and not something that's accessible to ordinary folks. How do we get closer, and I mean like really closer, to ordinary people's needs and desires with these tools and with these processes? How do we get like really concrete inside their lives?
Gosh, I feel like it's all these things coming together at once. It's the technology, the products getting better, but it's also I think a lot these days about institutions. I think a big bias of tech people is we do not understand or appreciate or have any interest in institutions. We think, oh, everything should just be direct to consumer. Just go on Twitter,
put it on
your blog, make an app, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at how normal people learn new things, it's through some kind of institution, their company, their school, a neighborhood group, their extended family. It's like these pillars of institutions of our society, and they move slow. They change. They take decades to change anything.
So I have a thesis I developed over the last 30 years that our institutions have been designed from mistrust of the average person. And because they don't trust people, they create coercive measures to keep everybody in line. If you're in the compulsory education system, you're divided up by grades. Now is when we're going to learn mathematics. Now is when we're going to learn history, whatever. And that when you design from trust, when you start to trust people, you build an entirely different world with different rules. And Wikipedia and the internet are both designed from trust. And the question I ask people is, do you remember the first time you understood how Wikipedia works? When you realize that any fool on the planet can make a change to the collective encyclopedia, and that somehow, I don't know why, but somehow that works, right? The joke is that Wikipedia is something that works in practice, but not in theory. And so I love institutional design. I'm sort of going there, and I'm wondering, where have you taken those thoughts on institutional design? What institutions would we need? What would you see anyone build, and how to solve for these problems?
I've been working for the very first time with teams to teach them how to implement mindful productivity systems and tools for thought and working together. And it's a lot harder than any of the work that I've done with individuals so far. And it's linked to what you were discussing earlier, Thiago, about the marketing, the communication, just the positioning. I say something, people hear something slightly different. When we're in a one-to-one relationship, that's okay. When there's only one person that needs to understand it, and if the way they apply the system that I described deviates slightly from what I'm saying, that's okay. But when you try and teach it to a team of 10 people or more working together, you start seeing all of those little differences in between the way people interpret people add up. And because it's a complex system, you end up with a mess, basically. So it's really hard to try and find the right balance between being very prescriptive and telling them this is exactly how you should do it, and you really need to stick to that if you wanted to work with the rest of your team or within an institution, but also being realistic, because I find that some of the most rigid systems, they're not sustainable, they don't work, people don't know how to adapt them, how to tweak them to their specific use cases. And so I'm very early in that process. And I mean, Thiago, you've had so many cohorts, so you probably have more experience with this, but I find it so far a very interesting dance where I'm always trying to figure out if I'm getting too rigid or if I'm giving them too much flexibility, which are equally going to end up in a very messy kind of web where nothing makes sense.
I love that. That makes so much sense to me. Go ahead, Thiago.
I think part of the challenge with teaching, I mean, we're kind of teaching these things, or when we're communicating, is like we're trying to convey a stack. There's a whole stack, a very deep stack of not just knowledge, but skills, attitudes, mindsets, paradigms. And some of the lower layers on the stack, like the lowest layers, are like literacy. And 90-something% of the population knows how to read and write. But how about tech literacy? Is just a couple steps above. Most people are not tech literate at all. They know how to use a browser, check email, and do a couple other things. But if someone is not tech literate, there is no chance they are going to create a system. They're going to get caught on I can't log in. Where I really learned this was at the Apple Store. When you sit, and actually before the Apple Store, I had a business where I drive around to people's houses and help them with their computers.
Oh, cool.
When you sit that was kind of my first entrepreneurial venture, driving around in my Honda Civic. And usually I would try to fix their computer, but then I would always end up at the same solution, which was to reformat their hard drive and reinstall Windows.
Oh, perfect.
But it's so humbling sitting next to someone and being like, okay, I'm really going to help them solve this challenge. And then you spend 30 minutes trying to log in. It's so mind-boggling, the lack of digital literacy that's out there that prevents people from accessing every other benefit that technology provides.
Absolutely. So what sticks? What works with people? For both of you, when you've got workshops, seminars, other sorts of things, where do you get engagement? And I'll give you a tiny example. Ward Cunningham, the inventor of the wiki, was on a call. It was an advisory call. I happened to be on the call as well. And he said, one way that I get people to start using wikis is I will go in and start a page for their wiki, and I'll intentionally make some mistakes. And the moment they push me aside and say, no, that's wrong, and they start editing and they hit save, that's a win. So the intentional, clumsy, like mistake, because they don't want to see mistakes go in, that will get them sort of to jump, to cross the hurdle of maybe use much more, I think, than logic and appeals to reason that say, hey, this is a cool tool, you should use it. How does that work for your work with other people trying to figure out their way through all this?
Yeah, for me, you have to find a project. It's the only real way I've found. There's something in each person's life that is just beyond their current capabilities. There's a higher order goal or desire or dream or problem they're trying to fix that is just beyond what they can do with all their current knowledge and skills. You have to find that thing that is just beyond their grasp and say, hey, technology is a lever. It's an extension that you could use to reach that thing. And that's the first problem, and the core problem is always motivation. If someone has enough motivation, they can solve all the other problems. If they don't have motivation, they can't solve any other problem.
And Laura?
No, it's a virtually identical answer here. I found that by asking them to choose a specific project that they want to work on with some sort of output that they'd like to create, it all makes it a lot easier. It does create motivation, as Thiago said. And it is also just a way to test things, to try things. And when it doesn't work out, they will keep on trying because they want this thing to succeed. I don't think many people outside of engineering are enjoying trying to figure out what's not working in a tool or a system. They just want it to work, but they can bear with the challenges and with the difficulties in understanding exactly how to make it work if, as Thiago said, there's a higher order aim behind learning how to use those tools and those systems.
Do you ever get into conversations about what are the higher order goods that can come out of this work, out of sharing what we know? Like what are the bigger goals? What are the large, ambitious things we might be able to help happen?
Yeah, so that's so good because then that becomes the bottleneck, right? I find that I spend a surprisingly large amount of time trying to unlock those for people. Like it's a real thing, telling them you are good enough, you know enough.
Right.
Your time is worth spending in that way.
And others
You're
are
allowed.
interested in what you have to say.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a permissioning, I think, that actually we all need. This is what largely mentors and coaches do for us, role models. Most people don't have a mentor. Most people don't have a role model that they can directly model themselves off of. And so in a way, as online creators, that's how I see what we do. We're like mass distributed role models for people, at least in this area. I don't know if I'm a role model in most areas of my life, but in this one I can be.
Yeah, yeah. I'm realizing that when I first saw the brain, I was a tech industry trends analyst. And my job really was to know who funded whom, who competes with whom, what companies got what people in it, all that kind of thing. And so that's the first thing I started putting in my brain. And the brain turned out to be better at that than any database I'd tried. And, was a HyperCard fan back in the day. I keep running into HyperCard fans in this community, but tried lots of different tools. And suddenly I was off and running with high motivation because this tool suited that very specific purpose that was the core of my job. And then later I started doing other things and running off. And then I wanted to add a second thing that goes back to what Anne-Laure was saying a little earlier, which is, if the brain had told me specifically how to do things and what to name them and where to put them, I'm not sure I would have stuck with it either. Part of the joy for me was discovering the capabilities and then appropriating the system to do what I wanted to do, figuring out naming conventions. I have a series of what I call cliches. I always put authors above their books. I always put actors under their movies because they're acting in a movie. But if the movie is based on a novel, the novel will be above. You might have decided to use that completely differently, and that's just fine, right? But making sense of the world is this really fun activity. And again, I feel like I'm multiple sigmas off the mean here from ordinary people just trying to get sort of, their normal day done. And I'm sad that that's the case.
Yeah, but a lot of people, even though they are trying to just get through their day, if you talk to, I can't remember the stat, like what's the percentage of people who say that they have a novel in them? So like they would like to write a novel at some point. I think the fact that people are dreaming this big, it doesn't mean they're going to write that novel, but that dream is there. Means that even if every day they just go through their day, they may end up going home feeling completely exhausted, and the only thing they want to do is completely understandably but watch TV and not necessarily try and tinker in a note-taking system trying to connect ideas together when you're already feeling so tired. But the desire to learn more, to create more, to build a legacy, to connect with other people, I think is here for most people. And so it's not really about building better systems at this stage, because we do have pretty good systems. We have pretty good tools. It says, I don't think that's where the friction is coming from. It's exactly what Thiago said. It's about giving people that confidence that those ideas, whatever they are, they do matter, and that they should actually take a little bit of that time or the little bit of energy that they have left after a long day, even if it's 5 minutes per day or 10 minutes per day, to try and cultivate those ideas and maybe share them with the world.
I just Googled your question, and there's a 2002 opinion piece in the New York Times that says, according to a recent survey, 81% of Americans feel they have a book in them and that they should write it. Right. 81 is a much higher number than I thought was going to be there. Any last thoughts? Anything you'd like to add to the conversation?
I would just encourage people to try it out. There's more ways to do what we're just... If this is something that you're wondering if it's for you, there's more ways to do it at more levels of, sophistication through more different kinds of software than ever. If you need a guide, if you need someone to kind of hold your hand through it, both Anne-Laure and I are available for that. But it's a really exciting time for this world of, opening up your brain to the world.
Love that. Thanks, Thiago. And Laura, any thoughts? Concluding?
Yeah, I know we started with private versus public brain, but I think it doesn't really matter if you decide to keep it private or public. Just starting to collect those ideas and connecting them together. I think this is 80% of the really good work that you can do here for yourself. And then you'll see where it takes you. You'll see if you like it and how much further you want to go. As Thiago said, just getting started, I think, is the most exciting step.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you all for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that just might help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in this sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com.